Hi, Sher.
Hey, Candace, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great too. Yeah.
Well, we're going to have a different topic today on shame for our episode 8. We've had several discussions about why it's just important that we name some things about shame as we move forward.
Yeah. I think the reality is everyone struggles with shame, particularly. I mean, everyone does. That's the truth. But if you have had childhood trauma,
Mhm.
especially repeated um, episodes of being harmed, especially if it occurred in your home, not only, but especially if it occurred in your home from your primary caregivers or, from a family member, there's going to be shame and a lot of shame that is embedded deep into the fabric of who you
Mhm.
are, who we are. And the thing that's so important about shame, I think, like the big question of, well, why should we deal with shame? And my answer is because shame blocks love.
Mhm.
And we all want love. We are all longing for love, but shame blocks love. And I love the quote from Rumi where he said, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have
Mhm.
built against it.
Mhm.
And that's what shame does. It really causes us to establish these barriers so that love really cannot reach those secret and hidden places of our soul that we feel are dirty and ugly and unworthy.
Yeah, because shame makes us feel like we are unworthy.
Yeah.
It sends us messages that we haven't just done something bad, but we are bad.
Yeah.
And really, it's about the core of who we are
Mm-hmm.
and that we are loved. And when shame gets in there, like you said, it's going to block us from being able to not only receive love, but really give love.
Yeah. And we wanted to just offer a quote tonight from Brene Brown because she's the person who has studied shame more than probably anyone else. And I really appreciated her saying shame is the most powerful master emotion.
Mm-hmm.
It is the fear that we are not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line with shame is it's the fear that we are not good enough. And when we feel that we aren't good enough, it puts us into cycles of hiding and pretending and performing. Or Brene Brown says secrecy, silence, and judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those words, I think, are so powerful and have such huge impacts on our life and our relationships and just the way that we are able to do life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shame is a very painful emotion. And, as littles, we aren't going to be able to identify, I feel shame right now.
Mm.
But we, like you said, we feel it, even though we don't name it, and we maybe hide or we keep something a secret. We begin judging ourselves. And as we grow older, we look for ways to relieve that pain. We
Yeah.
look for ways to um, cope with the pain of shame. And that the way people do that varies. Some people get um, some relief through addictions. Some just shut down and don't allow themselves to feel emotions, become avoidant. There are multiple ways that we try to silence the voice of shame through coping behaviors. And where that gets complicated is when we meet someone, or even as we are processing our own journey, and the ways that we've tried to silence shame also produces guilt.
Yeah. which then becomes the big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Our behaviors, all the things that we're doing really to survive, but in the eyes of society, often those things are not acceptable. So they get us into trouble. And so often, I think, rather than feeling like we have somebody who will dive in, right, and start trying to get to our heart, rather than that, to say, like, why are you doing this anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than that, we get the eyes of judgment that say you are bad because you are doing bad things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we focus on the behavior. And until we get to the shame that's driving the behavior, we may get, there may be a moment where we get out of the behavior because there are behaviors that we, are destructive, self and other destructive behaviors. But until we get to the shame that has been driving that behavior, it's going to circle back around. And you may choose a different behavior to quiet that pain again. But it's when we meet people with true empathy and we begin to silence the voices of judgment with seeing and soothing and providing security and safety in those places where shame has blocked love, then we can really start to see, really without making it about behavior, we see behavior changes.
Yeah, it's so good. And you use the words, something about until we get to the shame that is driving the behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to just bring us back a little bit to those early years in life when these foundations of shame are established. And when we go through particular stories of harm, a child will always take the blame. Mm-hmm. They will always believe that they are somehow at fault for whatever it is that happened. Even if it happened to them, they will believe that they are at fault, and a child cannot point the finger at a parent and say, it's the parent who is struggling here. It's the parent who is doing something they shouldn't. The child will always believe that it is something about them that prevents their parent from being kind or loving or good. Mm-hmm. And so it's that shame then that gets established really young in life, often, most of the time, and then drives those behaviors. And so what do we want to say here about that shame that gets, I think a story would be good. And we were talking a little bit beforehand about a story that we would want to share. And Kandace, you have a story to share from when you were pretty young about just how some feelings of shame swept over you. And just wondering if you want to share that story.
Yeah, I'll share that story. And I want to mention before I share the story that shame is either something that feeling shame can result from something that's been done to us, something that we've done, or just shame by association. It's just being connected to a group or a family that has been judged. And so when I was in probably second or third grade, I overheard a girl talking about that she couldn't come and spend the night at our house. My parents were divorcing, and in my small community, that was still very, very few people did. And so there was this sense of, okay, even as a young child, I started to realize there's something bad about our family, and that thing makes other kids not to get to spend the night at our house.
Mm.
And so I, couldn't really name it then, but I did always have this sense that there were a group of kids that were better. There was something special about them. And, I know that's true because I ended up getting invited to this person's birthday party at their house. And I remember feeling, wow, I must be special to get to go to their house. And really that's shame, because it's that comparison, there's this special group. And I told you this and we kind of laughed about it, but it's just true. The way we do this in shame, well, they're better, but I'm not quite as bad. So, it's almost trying to manage, okay, how bad or how good am I? And all of that comes from shame.
Yeah. And I love how you mentioned the word comparison. And because I do believe that we struggle a lot with comparison. And how does comparison fit into this whole picture of shame?
Mm-hmm. Well, shame lies to us. There again, I guess the strongest lie is that we're not good enough.
Yeah.
But that sets us up to compare, because we will judge people and ourselves in light of our idea of what's good and what's bad, instead of being able to look at the core of who someone is and call them created and beloved and, who we truly are. Yeah. Accepted.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, you heard that said about you when you were pretty young. And I'm just wondering, how did that, or did it, would you say that event kind of affected you in the through the coming years? Like just kind of having that sense of, ooh, there are people in my world who think that I'm not good enough. Like what did that do to you?
Well, several of my other stories too. So that was one of several that set me up to feel fundamentally flawed, to feel just, I remember feeling it even in junior high and high school. It's one of the reasons I, when I got introduced to alcohol, there was something about having that relief of, for this time, I just didn't care, And so, yeah, I have great empathy and compassion for coping behaviors that is trying to silence the voice of shame, but as we know, ends up producing a lot of guilt.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about how in our culture, and this is probably true everywhere, among humans, but we haven't been very good, at least in my world or my experience, right? We have not been very good about being able to show kindness to people who are acting out in ways that really are screaming, I need help. Somebody help me. Right? Like it's why this maybe is a whole different conversation, but why is it so hard to walk toward people who really are screaming, I need help. And I'm desperate here, trying to just survive. Why do you think it's so hard for people to walk toward that?
Well, because we also judge the way people cry out saying that they need help. I personally think we all need help.
Yeah.
And so somebody may be crying out through more destructive behaviors, but somebody may be crying out for help through a temper that's out of control. We actually, in shame, will judge people's behaviors in how they cry out for help. And so I think it's a good question to ask, Cher, because when we are acting out ourselves in the way that we can and do, and when we see someone else, I think it's just a compassionate question to say, where's the pain? Yeah, what's going on here? I provide that for myself quite frequently now.
Yeah.
Like what is it right now that I'm feeling pain about, emotional pain?
Yeah. I love that. And just the way that you're learning to do it for yourself. We long for it from others, and it's beautiful when it comes from others. And it's also beautiful when we can offer that to our own soul. I want us to talk a little bit about how shame can be healed, because while shame is such a huge issue for all of us. And like you said, it's even our shame that judges other people's behavior that is rooted in their shame. And so we kind of have these ongoing cycles or scenarios where shame is played out, even in the back and forth of our close relationships, husbands and wives, parents and children, friendships, right? We often, I wonder if we're just kind of bouncing a ball of shame back and forth between each other, trying to do the best we can, but below everything is kind of this sense of, I know that I'm not good enough. I know that I'm hiding parts of myself, or I may not even be aware that I am. But how do we move toward healing shame? I think this is so important that we talk about this, because you and I know, and we have begun to really experience the healing of shame in our lives. Shame that we have lived with for many, many years, and we are beginning to see deep shame healed in our lives.
Yeah. And I know for me, I've had, a strong faith in that. I believed, like, when I thought of God, right, that he really could look at me and know me and still love me. Okay. Like, I had a head knowledge of that. But when I started encountering, because he knew it all, right? And he said that he still loves me.
Yeah.
And I did have a faith that I believed that was true in my head. But when I began to experience it in my friendships, with you and our story group, where, okay, you guys may not and do not know everything like I believe God does. You know more than anyone. And you have not turned away. Yeah. You have stayed. You have spoken into that secrecy and the judgment, and you've stayed. And, there's been a few times I have shown up in story group, and, I've shared something and I've put my hands over my eyes. The shame that I have felt in those moments just felt too much to even look. And then, of course, when I did, the eyes that were meeting me and the words and the tenderness began to rewire my brain that I am worthy to be loved, even in my failures.
Yeah.
And I've heard you say this before, I can't get enough of it now.
Yeah.
That's why we show up in story group every week.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And Brene Brown talks about how it's empathy, right? When our shame is met with empathy, which is like somebody else meeting us, not with judgment, but with the heart that says, who I see before me is worthy to be loved, and I will walk toward you. And I'm not judging you because I know that I also have my own struggles and my own stories. And right. So it's like we can move toward each other with empathy and love and kindness because we're also showing up and being real about our own feelings of shame and bringing our own stories where, we have carried so much shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's always so powerful when we, even over, the weeks that follow after we've shared a story, how we see and experience more freedom.
Yep.
In those particularities. And that's why we believe in story work, because I've said this before, like shame can't be met with vagueness. This vague, you're okay, or I love you. Those things are great. I'm not saying there is never a time that we don't say things like that. But shame has to be extracted out with precision.
Yeah.
And that takes knowing the stories.
Yeah. And it takes I was sitting in some of Brene Brown's quotes today, and she really talks a lot about how healing requires vulnerability, courage, trust, authenticity, and risk. And I was thinking about kind of this scenario of how healing requires that I walk into the room. Like that's first, right? Like I have to walk into the room. I can't just be alone in my shame and think that it's going to someday be gone. It won't. It will always be with me. But first, I have to have the courage to walk into the room. Then I have to be willing to and vulnerable and take off some of my heavy protective armor, whatever that looks like. But all the things that have been protecting me, like I have to be willing to let that down, at least a piece of it, not all of it, but at least a piece of it. Then I have to be willing to stand in the light, right? I have to be willing to say, here is a piece of my story. And I'm struggling with this and I don't even want to show you, but here it is. And I allow you to see a piece of the real me. Like that takes, it's vulnerability, it's courage, it's trust, right? I trust you enough because you've shown me, you've given me a glimpse that I have hope, that I can show you a piece of the real me. And I do all of that knowing that this is a huge risk because I cannot control the outcome. Like you might have empathy. You might hear me well. You might see me. You might respond with love and care, or you might walk away. You might judge me, right? So there's always risk involved, and it's hard. This walking the path to healing shame requires these things like vulnerability, courage, trust, authenticity, risk. Like we cannot heal if we do not take some risks. And we have to be looking for where are the safe places that I can begin to do this work? Who is a safe enough person that I can at least move toward in some way and give them some glimpse to see how they will respond to my story?
Yeah, it is hard, but it is worth it. And I just want to say, we have listeners that maybe have stepped into that a little bit and got hurt.
Yeah.
And so they've pulled back, but we actually have a deep cry in our hearts to be known, to be seen, to be loved, just as we are. And you may quiet that cry, you may numb it again, but my hope is that you'll risk again. And it took me a long time to find the place and the people that could really help me get out of years and years of shame. But it was worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are people out there that can and will. And it's part of the hard work is keep looking, keep working toward finding someone who can hold and contain your story. It's worth it. So worth it.
Yeah. Good to be with you today, Sher. Hard topic, but there's so much hope.
So much hope, because shame can be healed. Like, we know that this is true. We're living examples of experiencing the goodness that comes when shame is met with love.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good to be with
Love
you, friend.
Yep. Love you.
Love you too.